and we're going to continue our flood coverage with analyst and author Elaine Kub. She's our guest this week. Elaine, thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure.
So to begin, the first thing we have to talk about is the weather. So flooding, that's the big story here. You're in South Dakota. Paint us a picture of what it's been like for you guys there and what it's like now.
Yeah, that last big storm was really tricky logistically just because it was very heavy snow, and we're still seeing that snow. If you look at the snow depth map in the United States, here in the eastern Dakotas and Minnesota, you're still got 10 to 20 inches of snow cover. So yeah, that's going to take some time, and it has implications for the folks down in southeastern South Dakota where there's flooding, and of course Nebraska where there's flooding. I mean, we deal with moving the snow around and feeding cows in the snow, but then we go inside and see the news footage from Nebraska or hear from friends or see on Facebook and Twitter all of that flooding footage, and it just nauseates me, and it's terrible. And it's a reminder that snow is easier to deal with than mud, of course, and it's also a reminder, you look behind me, there's a 20-foot snowdrift here. All of this is still going to melt and still get sent down the Missouri River toward you guys. I understand that the snowpack in the Rockies is actually lower than average this year, so that's one less piece of stuff coming at us, but there's still all of this snow melt from the northern plains that is still going to get sent down, and this flooding problem that you're experiencing in Nebraska is going to persist for a while here.
And it's March, late March even. Lots of folks, they're wanting to get planting, but the way this weather has been, it's hard to see that happening anytime soon or maybe at all for some folks this season. How is that going to impact everything?
Yeah, it's a problem. So by April 1st, Nebraska tends to have about 20% of its oats planted, and I know it's not a huge crop, but it's just a benchmark for the small grains. We're already in this time frame where small grains in the next couple of weeks, folks would ordinarily like to get started on that. Like I mentioned, the eastern Dakotas and Minnesota would like to get started on planting some spring wheat. That's probably not going to happen, like you mentioned. So then you're talking about acreage switching, and you're talking about pushing it back farther and farther and potentially getting some prevented planted acres. I know that's been a conversation going around for folks speaking with their insurance agents and wondering what's going to happen for that. Because you didn't get a lot of field work done in the fall, people are going to have to wait longer. Who knows how long it's going to take for some of this flooding to dry out or the snow melt to dry out. We really do not know the schedule of that, and we really just wait and see. The markets wait and see how late the planting season or the field work season will get pushed back.
And what about your farm? Could you give us some insight into how you're approaching the season?
Well, I'm just waiting for it to melt. I think a lot of no-till acres, it's not going to be a problem. If you didn't have ruts coming in from last fall, you'll be able to proceed in a normal fashion once it eventually dries out. We have big equipment, and so they say the United States could get all of its corn planted in a week if it had to, just using the size of the equipment and the scale, the economies of scale that folks have. But we have to get to that point where the ground is dry enough. And with that flooding scenario, I believe there are acres lost. There's topsoil that has been lost. There's going to be a yield impact. Even if the acres get planted, I believe there will be a yield drag on a lot of these western Corn Belt acres.
And you were mentioning the video earlier that we've seen, when you look at grain bins, just video of the grain bins just sitting in what looks like a lake or something. And my first thought is all that stored grain that's in there. So big problem here.
Big problem, yeah. We saw in the soybeans especially, right? We saw in the last grain stocks report that there are more soybeans on farm than usual, 30% more than last year at this time. And the majority of the soybeans, U.S. soybean stocks on December 1st were on farm bins. And we see some of those bins getting flooded, as you mentioned. The Des Moines Register had a piece this week suggesting that in one county in Iowa, they're looking at upwards of $7 million of losses in stored corn and soybeans. Like I mentioned, that soybeans is really the big problem. I don't know how much of that has really been moved off of the farms to commercial storage facilities in this sort of logistically challenging winter. So yes, wet weather, the humidity, the warmingness, the warmer weather that we're experiencing now, none of that is going to be helpful for the quality of these soybeans that are eventually going to try and get blended off into the market.
And over the winter, maybe even over the past week or so especially, what are some of the biggest concerns from the farmers that you've been speaking with?
Well, I think it's just a sense of anxiety. And we always feel this way before planting season, just the sense of there's so much to do. How are we going to get it all done? How are we going to fit it all into the time allotted? And pushing back the planting season because of this terrible winter and this long, wet winter and this wet experience here in the start of spring, that just tightens up that scenario and makes it more anxious for everybody. So I think that's the biggest threat, and it's not necessarily a market threat, it's just a psychological threat of just how anxious it makes everybody to try and fit it all in.
So what about the long-term outlook? Because, I mean, you've got the flooding, then you add in the snowy winter that we've had, trade concerns always making news. It just seems like we can't catch a break so far in 2019.
No, I see that in the markets. You're right. We really haven't had a response to these troubles. Last week, the new crop corn market put on 7.5 cents, which is good, but it wasn't the short covering that we've been looking for. The speculators are very net short in corn futures. They have about 2.5 times as many bearish positions as they have bullish positions. So we would expect to see, a bullish concern like this, a weather concern, come in and really start to spark a big flight to the exits there and a big upward movement. And that might still happen. I suspect what we may be seeing is the speculators are still waiting until the end of March, waiting until that big prospective plantings report gets out of the way. And then if we're still seeing these logistics problems, this late spring planting season, then perhaps we really will see that boost. I would look for that just in the sense of the short covering that we know must happen eventually.
And as we wrap up here, in spite of the floods, in spite of what has been a rough 2019 for lots of folks, any other advice that you can say to the farmer watching right now who needs that encouragement, needs that advice, needs some help with some short-term and long-term decisions that they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not in the business of giving good psychological advice, just to hang in there with the anxiety that we mentioned. But as far as marketing advice goes, I would say just to not give up on a marketing plan. I think that's one reason that folks hold back from making marketing decisions. They think, well, what if I don't get it planted? What if it doesn't actually get grown? And that is probably a legitimate concern with folks with river bottom ground this year, that there will be fewer acres in their operation. But there will still be something. I think everybody can feel confident that they will still have some grain to market, and they shouldn't give up on it right now. They should continue on their seasonal marketing plans.
All right, Elaine Kub, we appreciate you taking the time to join us today. We'll do it again soon. Maybe next time we won't have a big snowdrift behind you too.
I certainly hope so, Troy.